Hi, my name is Jeff Yeoman. I'm a contractor to the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and the purpose of this recording is to overview material that we would often present at a public meeting, whether it's in person or virtually, and this is a generic one, not adapted to a specific community or county. However, a lot of the information that we'll cover here is going to be presented in a typical public meeting, so this will help you get your questions perhaps answered beforehand about the process, what's involved, what information you need to know, and you can come better prepared or ask specific questions afterwards. So the purpose of this meeting here is to provide background on why there is even a flood study update and who's involved in that process, to overview what goes into a study, what data is available, the typical timeline, and to explain the mapping results. I'll present what floodplain maps would generally look like, but you would see specific results at the actual community meeting. And I'll present some information here on insurance and development implications of being in a floodplain, provide some additional resources and next steps. And then typically at a public meeting, we would have an open discussion to get your questions answered and look over your specific property if helpful to you. So for our outline, what I'll cover here, I'm going to talk a little bit about the NFIP, which is the National Flood Insurance Program, a little bit of background on floodplain management, and then we'll go into the study review and the results and mapping, and then we'll close with insurance appeals and resources. So as for the first question, why is this important? Well, the answer is because floods are devastating. They're one of the most financially expensive natural hazards that our nation experiences. And as you've probably noticed or seen, they are not static. Flood risk does change over time with changing climate, changing ground conditions. And so our job here as part of updating that information is to keep it current so that those hazards can be evaluated and mitigated where possible, and to help communicate that information to protect life, health, and safety. There's also an official requirement for any community that's participating in the flood insurance program that this mapping information be kept current. And those participating in the NFIP, there's specific building and regulations that are associated with the program. There's insurance requirements for homeowners. And like I mentioned, as part of the Code of Federal Regulations, those communities are required to keep flood risk current and to also update or inform the public of that risk information. So a little bit of background on the NFIP. It's a voluntary program that communities can elect or opt into. And if you're part of that program, then you can receive disaster grants and information or helpful resources after those occurrences. And then also it allows homeowners to buy insurance based on what zone they're in. If the community does not participate in the NFIP, then an individual homeowner cannot purchase insurance through that program. And this is a program that's overseen by federal agencies, primarily FEMA and FIMA. And it's managed by the communities, enforced by lenders, and then informed often by the state. So our role here as a mapping contractor to the Colorado Water Conservation Board is to determine those the risk and provide that information on flood insurance rate maps that are used by the National Flood Insurance Program. So in terms of who's involved, there's community officials, so the local level, the state level, FEMA or the federal level, and then private stakeholders. And here's kind of an overview of some of the individual responsibilities for each of those roles. Primary message here is it is a partnership with each person kind of playing their own role. The local community has to administer the NFIP, communicate the risk to the public, and manage local construction and enforcement of regulation and ordinances. The state is often the leader in the study with initiating these studies and overseeing them and partnering with FEMA in terms of funding. And then often has a contractor like ourselves to help create some of that mapping information. FEMA manages a lot of the requirements, guidance, the technical specifications, and the funding for the study, and they also manage the NFIP, like I mentioned earlier. And then at times there's private stakeholders, such as like a watershed coalition that would help oversee making sure that correct data is incorporated. In terms of what a typical study would look like in timeline, I'll go over that now. Again, we would typically include information on this slide here, but you can go to our website at the bottom. You can see it, coloradohazardmapping.com. There's a story map, and you can find that information on your particular county level, and then you can also enter your home address if you'd like to look at a specific location. So in terms of what a typical process involves, first is collecting terrain data. So that reflects the ground surface, and that's usually done with something called a LiDAR, which stands for light and detection ranging. It's basically flying a plane over the ground surface and bouncing different spectrums of light, and you can see the contours of the surface. Then we create a digital elevation model. Typically, this data is available upon request, and either in the form of the 2-foot contours or a DEM, digital elevation model. If it's a detailed study, we'll supplement it with field survey. So this can be information from the actual channel dimensions below the water surface, or at any structure or crossing, such as a bridge, a culvert, a dam, a pipe, etc. And we'll put that information into our models. We also do hydrology, which is basically a study of how much water would occur during specific events based on probabilities. So this is often done with stream gauges or rain gauges, but it's a statistical approach to figure out how much water would happen. And that information's on our website. It'll show all the flow change locations that we used. And that gets put into a hydraulic model, which is also online. And hydraulics is basically if you were to have a certain amount of water from hydrology that's put through a cross section based on your terrain and survey, and you assign roughness and different structures, hydraulics figures out how high that water surface elevation is. We take that water surface elevation and we interpolate it between modeled cross sections, and then we plot out a floodplain, basically where the edge of that water surface elevation meets our digital elevation model, and that extent shows what we're calling our floodplain for the different recurrence intervals, and that information's on our web viewer as well. And then by the time we get to this point with the public meeting, it's because the preliminary flood insurance rate maps have been provided to the communities, and it initiates a formal process of going through review, and then if accepted, then they'll be adopted. So here's kind of an overview of the regulatory schedule. I'll just draw your attention to anything in red here as we go along. It's approximate time frame in months. This can change. It's specific to each schedule, or each project, but this is a generic idea. So if we use time 0 as when the preliminary flood insurance rate maps are first issued, then typically about a month after, we hold an official meeting called a CCO with the communities, and that's with the officials. Following that meeting, let's say maybe a month after that, so 2 months after prelim, is when we typically hold one of these meetings, a public meeting, to kind of overview all this information with the public. And we always try and do that before the appeal period begins. The appeal period might be another 2 months after a meeting like this. It'll begin after the issuance of newspaper articles, and those will then start the 90-day period. So it'll end, let's say, 7 months out. And that is the official period, which they'll receive comments on any of the study information, and I'll go into that more later. Depending on what comments are received, maybe 8 months to 12 months after the preliminary flood insurance maps are released, that might be when everything's finalized through a letter of final determination, after which there's a 6-month period for communities to adopt it. So the net takeaway from this slide for you is, if you've heard that the preliminary flood insurance rate maps have come out, it'll be anywhere between a year to a year and a half before this information tends to generally become effective and regulatory, and then actually impact insurance rates. So looking at, continuing through our outline, I'll kind of show you some generic results in terms of what floodplain mapping looks like. So the first question that we need to ask, though, is, do these results that we're mapping depict actual flooding? And the short answer is no, but it could. But what we're mapping are hypothetical or predictive simulations. So when we talk about the 100-year floodplain, it's actually properly called the 1% annual chance. And what that means is that in any given year, there's a 1% chance that a flood of that magnitude could occur. So we're not trying to replicate a historic event that's already happened. We're looking at our record of data and then statistically deriving what would potential events be if we looked at a 1% or a 0.2% chance, which we often refer to as a 500-year floodplain. But in reality, we know that the results may actually differ. And some of this is because our models are based on data at the time it was collected, which in some cases might be 2 or 3 years old by the time we get to this point, based on whenever the terrain was collected. And we also know that in reality, sometimes logs or mobile homes or debris will create dams, and it'll actually cause the water to move outside of the channel, and those sort of things can't be predicted. So if the mapping looks different than what you've personally experienced, that could be one of the reasons why. But this provides the best available information at the time that the data was collected. So in terms of what a flood insurance rate map might look like, here's an example on the left here with typical symbology. So kind of running through the middle there, kind of looks like a candy cane with red and blue hatching. That's called a floodway. That's part of the 1% or the 100-year floodplain, but it's a developmental portion. It's something that has an additional regulation piece to it, but it is still part of the 100-year floodplain, which you see here in blue called Zone AE. So anything that's a Zone A, whether it's AE, AO, AH, or just A, is going to be a 100-year or 1% chance floodplain. But AE specifically here is denoting that it's an enhanced or a detailed portion. Then what you see in the orange is going to be the 500-year or the 0.2% chance. We often call that a shaded X, which has different connotations with it. It's not part of the special flood hazard area. Anything in the special flood hazard area, which is basically your Zone A's, has different insurance requirements. It's a mandatory purchase if you have a federally backed mortgage. Now, the black lines going across that are generally straight, those are cross sections. So this would have been modeled using a one-dimensional model. So you have a cross section at each one of those, and then it interpolates between. A 2D model would look different, often having a mesh or a grid that's overlaid this area. And all this information you can find on FEMA's Mapping Service Center or the National Flood Hazard layer for current effective mapping, as well as anything that's preliminary, which should be your county by the time we're at this meeting. So in terms of floodway, like I mentioned, this is a developmental restriction, and the whole, I guess, sentiment behind it or goal behind it is to not impact your neighbor. And so what we do when we model this is we encroach on each side approximately equal conveyance based in order to see how far can you come in or pull in from the edges of your 100-year or your 1% floodplain? How far can you come in before it raises the water surface elevation by a half foot? At least in Colorado, it's a half foot. And the reason why is you don't want someone coming in or a developer coming in, putting in a large warehouse that then constricts flow and raises the water surface elevation by over a half foot and now floods your property. So it's a way of protecting future development. And then anything outside of the floodway we refer to as the fringe. Now this slide is a placeholder for where you might see structure count information in terms of changes if you're already in an effective floodplain. And so those that might be added in or mapped out, but you can find this information as well on the website. So I guess the takeaway here is in terms of who is at risk of flooding, keep in mind when we're doing this mapping, this is a line on the map and it's a best estimate, but it's not absolute, and floods don't care how we actually map it in reality. So we're doing our best engineering judgment using data available at the time, but things can change and there can be new information and new conditions. So really everyone can be at risk of flooding to some degree. So to wrap this up, we're going to look at some information on insurance, appeals, and additional resources. When it comes to insurance, If you've already been in a floodplain and let's say now you're being mapped in a different zone, the requirements might be slightly different in terms of what zone you're in, but the program requirements haven't changed. It's just that your risk profile at your specific location has. In the NFIP, like I mentioned, they require insurance for any federally backed mortgage. Your lender will require insurance for that if you're in a special flood hazard area, anything with a zone A. However, caveat on that is lenders can require flood insurance anywhere based on their own discretion. So even if you're outside of a special flood hazard area, it might be that they require flood insurance anyway. And that's up to them to decide. So in terms of, and also on that note too, in terms of the federally backed mortgage, if you own your home outright, then that mandatory insurance purchase requirement isn't applicable. You don't. It's an optional thing. We would still recommend it, but it wouldn't be required. And you can purchase insurance anywhere within the county. You don't have to be within an actual mapped floodplain. You could be outside of one, and the rate of your insurance will be affected by what zone that you're actually mapped in. So we would still recommend looking into that. And then it's important to note that these zones, let's say you're in a zone change, that goes into effect with the new firms that are coming out, but not before that. So if you remember back to the timeline, there's a letter of final determination, then a 6-month period. So between prelim and when they go effective, it could be a year to a year and a half before these changes actually impact you. So on that note, you could get a preferred policy now, depending on if you're going to go from a lower risk to a higher risk zone. You could buy now and get a better rate and be grandfathered into that. And there's a lot of nuances that go into the grandfathering. So takeaway here is, you could get a preferred policy before if you're not mapped in, and you'll be added or mapped into the floodplain. Also remember, this doesn't mean that you're at no risk if you're outside of a mapped floodplain. You could still consider and may want to consider purchasing flood insurance. And based on the base flood elevation, which is the water surface elevation of the 1% flood, based on how that compares relative to your structure information, that may have an impact on your rates as well, and how you are grandfathered in if you did choose to go that route. And then let's say that you wanted to change this. You could look into different options, either a letter of map amendment, a LOMA, or a letter of map revision, and a LOMR, and we'll talk about those here shortly. As I mentioned earlier, there are development implications, and this will vary by county, but any community that's participating in the NFIP does have to enforce certain building restrictions or requirements and ordinances surrounding that. So you'll want to talk with your community about what specifically affects you. It is noteworthy that there are more restrictions. If you're within a floodway, it is more difficult to build or rebuild. And the best person to talk to would be your floodplain administrator, as the rules do change by community. So maybe you're asking, what can I do with this information? Is there anything I can do to change it? The short answer is there is one route that there's a couple routes you can do that, but in terms of where the information is right now, you can change it if you have technical data to support it. So simply saying, it hasn't done this before, or that wasn't my experience, or, I disagree with this isn't enough. But if you have technical data such as survey information or new topographic data or an actual hydrologic analysis, something like that could be reviewed and incorporated, and if it's approved, it could change the study information. And that would appeal the existing preliminary maps before they become effective. Now, if you wanted to wait until after that process, or let's say you're doing changes or improvements right now prior to when the study, or actually after the study was already conducted or initiated, that would be captured later in a letter of map revision. For it to be an appeal, it has to be data that existed when the study was conducted. Now, if you don't need to change the mapping itself, but let's say that that your structure is higher than what's reflected in the mapping, your structure itself could be pulled out of the zone designation through a letter of map amendment. And what that would do is it would change your structure assignment without actually doing a new study or a new mapping. And when you go through an appeal process, make sure to coordinate with the community through that whole process. This graphic quickly summarizes how to submit an appeal. At the top, you'll see the two different email addresses. One is for FEMA, one is for the state. The important piece, again, is to coordinate first with the community so that they're aware of it. And either the community might submit it on your behalf, or you as a homeowner could submit it, but work again with the community. And that would be sent again to the state and to FEMA, and they'll acknowledge it and then process that information. Again, if you wait until after that, let's say you're doing changes that are happening after the study was completed, that would not constitute an appeal. You could look at a letter of map revision, a LOMR, and that would tie into this information. So you wouldn't use the current effective information, you would use this new updated information as preliminary and make sure to leverage that and tie into that. And that would not go effective, your LOMR would not go effective until this preliminary mapping has already been adopted. In terms of other resources, we'll show at the last slide some examples, but you'll want to contact your local floodplain administrator for specific questions for your community. You can also reach out to the state or to FEMA on specific questions about the study or insurance or compliance. And then also listed a couple websites here that you can look at that have information on flood and how to prepare for it and to mitigate. And then also we have a website here with more information, like I've mentioned. So the URL has been on the bottom of the web page or this presentation the whole time. And there's a few different tiles here. So there's information on flood hazard and the county specific projects. And then the library has all the documents. A map is interactive, shows all of our areas, the FAQs, frequently asked questions. And then community rating systems, more used for community. So as a homeowner, you're mostly be interested in this tile here for flood hazard. And when you go there, there's a few different options. At the top, you can just enter in your address or a place or a town, and it'll zoom there. It'll present information on the current mapping and also the proposed updated mapping. And then you can also look at a specific county and look at all the information that went into it, including the terrain and hydrology and survey, hydraulics. You can look at floodplain maps. You can look at all the meetings that have happened. So it's a bunch of information there. And then on the bottom, there's some information that's more generic, like fact sheets and some tutorials for our website and other floodplain mapping considerations. So to conclude, the main message here for you is that the results are showing risk that is already there. We're just now putting it on a map, but that risk has been there all along. The data is, again, not going to be perfect or absolute, but it is based on best available information. This data will eventually be used for the flood insurance rate maps, and that could be, perhaps a year out, depending on time frame for your specific project. And the floodplains are not going to be effective until those firms are released. So you could take advantage now of perhaps being grandfathered in. And then also, please do ask questions, and some of those contacts are here. Hopefully you have your community contacts, since this is a generic presentation, but I've listed typical state and federal contacts that are often involved in these flood studies. For your time.